Chapter 29. The chirping of birds and the light filtering through the trees woke her first. There was some confusion when she realized she wasn't in her bed. Imagine her surprise when she realized instead of a pillow, she was curled up on Gabe's chest. They must have fallen asleep outside last night. She took the time to look at him closely while he slept. His eyelashes were surprisingly long, shadowing his cheeks. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his short beard, wondering if it was soft or coarse. That's when he opened his eyes. Seeing her, they crinkled as he smiled. Gruffly, he said, "Good morning." Before she could snatch her hand back, he grabbed her wrist, bringing her hand to his lips in a soft kiss before placing it on his chest and holding it over his heart. "Right, good morning." Imogen cleared her throat nervously. "I think yesterday got to me more than I realized. It's not like me to sleep where I stop. In the military, I learned to sleep when and where I can. You never know when you'll be able to lay flat and get a full 8 hours. Makes sense. I can't imagine ever getting used to that. I'm a bit high maintenance. Even growing up, my friends would go camping, but I always preferred a nice mattress." "I think you're doing all right. That's not something I'd want you to get used to anyway." He stroked her arm absently while he spoke. She knew she should be distancing herself, but it was nice to pretend for a minute they could be something they weren't. Gabe was special, and she had to admit, he'd become not only a great friend, but someone she could see herself with if she stayed. But she wasn't staying. She stiffened up and pulled her arm away, sitting up and shaking out her bedhead. He slowly sat up next to her, moving carefully as if he knew she was about to make a run for it. "Imogen," he started, but she put her hand over his mouth to stop him, then moved it away as if burned by his lips. "Don't, Gabe. I've decided that I'm leaving once I get back to Aunt Jo's. This has been such an amazing experience, and you are a big part of that. But my life is back in New Jersey." Gabe said nothing. What could he say? She was a grown woman, and he wouldn't beg. But he couldn't help but feel she was making a mistake, and not just on a personal level. Since she'd been here, she'd made an impact on the locals, the animals, and had stepped out of her comfort zone numerous times, proving how strong she was. He didn't know how she didn't see it, but it was her life and her decision. He wouldn't make it harder for her. He only nodded. And if his easy agreement made Imogen's stomach clench, well, that was her secret. She stood up, squeezing his shoulder once, and went into her yurt to pack up her things. It didn't take long, and before she knew it, Gabe had loaded Fortune and Rowdy onto the trailer, and it was time to go. Imogen climbed into the truck and paused, glancing around the encampment. The guests, the yurts, the paddocks, and everything her friend had built with just an idea, a passion, and dedication. Then she closed the door and waited for Gabe to drive her home to her aunt. Joe was elated to see Imogen and hear all about the trip. There wasn't cell service in the mountains, so Imogen was met at the door with a very curious aunt and a pit bull pretending to be a jumping bean. Cookie was so excited to see her that she was practically bouncing off the walls, spinning in circles, her tail thwapping every nearby surface. One look at Imogen's tense demeanor and poker face, and Joe waved her in, leaning outside to wave to Gabe, who returned the gesture before closing the door. What happened? Joe wasn't one to mince words. Imogen inwardly cursed her aunt for being so aware. To give herself a moment, she took off her jacket and boots and set them by the door. But Joe wasn't a patient woman. She had the gray genes. "Imogen." The woman in question walked into the kitchen, Cookie sticking to her side like Velcro, and began to make herself a cup of tea. Joe pulled out a chair and sat. She knew she should give her time, but she also knew that if she did, Imogen would have time to evade. It was best to let her explode and get it out. So she pushed harder. Did something happen with Gabe? Imogen whipped around, fire in her eyes. She pointed a finger at her aunt. "Stop. I know what you're doing, and it isn't going to work." Her aunt was the picture of innocence. They both knew she was full of it. But now the gates were unlocked, and Imogen was ready to vent. Jo didn't smile. She knew it would only make things worse. Imogen began to crash around the kitchen, preparing tea for them both. If Jo wanted to wince when the mugs hit the countertop a little too hard, well, those could be replaced. Her niece was clearly having a crisis. Well, honey, there is clearly something wrong. You left all in excitement for the weekend, and here you are back in a clearly terrible mood. Gabe didn't come in with you for a visit. She let the words hang. Gabe had to go and load Rowdy and Fortune. He's not going to leave them in the trailer just to come in and have tea. No, of course not, honey. But it's not like him not to come up and say a few words. Did you two fight? Imogen laughed, but there was zero humor in it. What would we fight about? He's impossibly reasonable. If that man has a button to push, I haven't found it. Jo thought. That must drive someone like her niece crazy, who wore her emotions on the surface. Gabe was the opposite. In the many years she'd known him, from a small boy in a small town, leaving for the military, and coming back a more reticent man, he was the epitome of still waters run deep. He'd always been incredibly introverted and sensitive. She had to imagine that spending time with someone like Imogen would have a way of drawing him out of his shell. For Imogen, he must seem incredibly hard to read. Personally, she thought it was exactly what they both needed. It was bound to cause some difficulty, though. Imogen, you and Gabe handle things differently, but you know just as well as I do that just because he reacts differently to you doesn't mean that he doesn't feel. She paused, dipping the tea bag. Her back was to her aunt, but her shoulders dropped in defeat. There it is, thought Jo. She was over the temper, and now we can get to the heart of things. Aunt Jo, I'm leaving. Yes, honey, I know you've said that. I mean it. Do you? Why then are you so upset? Imogen came over, carrying the 2 mugs, and offered one to her aunt. She sighed. I don't really know why I'm upset. I came up here knowing I was only staying for a few weeks to help you out. I didn't count on making friends, restarting a hobby, and meeting Gabe. Her aunt finished for her. Ugh. Imogen put her head on the table and knocked it a few times. Yes, Gabe. He's become one of my best friends. I don't know how, because we're so different, but he's so easy to be around. He just kind of sucked me in, and... Imogen trailed off. And? Jo prompted. You have feelings for him. It was said as a statement. Imogen couldn't argue. She did, despite her best attempts at keeping her feelings to herself, have feelings for him. He was smart, easygoing where she was high-strung, calm when she was manic, and he was the first person she thought of when she woke up. In the few weeks she'd been here, he'd become someone she looked forward to talking to and seeing. I do, Aunt Jo, but my life isn't here. It's in New Jersey. Ah, so that's why Gabe was upset. Her niece had made up her mind, and he was distancing himself. And that clearly made Imogen upset. Is it really, though? I know you've grown up there, but you always seem to be searching for something. Since you've been here, you've dived into helping me, you've made amazing friends, and you've challenged yourself to do things outside your comfort zone. You've blossomed here. I know, you're right. I love it here, but I can't hide away in the mountains and play with animals forever. That isn't a career. What is this obsession with a career? Who says you have to sit down and have a 9-to-5 job at an office you hate going to every day? Why is that more important than finding something that makes you happy? Because, while it's fun in the short term, I'm tired of not having stability. I want to have both, a passion and a paycheck. That's very mature of you. Jo took a sip of her tea, chamomile, nice and calming. What makes you think you can't find that here? Imogen scoffed. Aunt Jo, this is a small town. There aren't exactly a lot of jobs available. But that wasn't quite right, was it? Bailey had offered her a job. It was seasonal, but still. Perhaps not, but why are you waiting to find something, Imogen? I've never known you to be passive, so why now? Why don't you create the life you want to live? She didn't have the answer. It never occurred to her to try. Where would she start? What would she do? No, it was best for her to leave as planned. She'd made the decision, and she was going to stick to it, even if leaving her friends and fortune made her eyes uncomfortably hot.